In the early days of the Cold War, the United States was locked in an arms race with the Soviet Union, pushing the limits of nuclear weapons technology. These weapons were unlike anything the world had seen before, capable of wiping out entire cities in seconds. But how could scientists and military officials truly understand the destructive power of these bombs? The answer was chilling. They built entire fake towns in the middle of the desert just to blow them up. These artificial communities, complete with houses, furnitures, cars, and even mannequins posed as families, were constructed to simulate what would happen to American life in the event of a nuclear attack. And the story behind these fake towns is one of the strangest and most haunting chapters of the atomic age. After World War II ended with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world entered an era of unprecedented fear and uncertainty. The atomic bomb had changed warfare forever, and the US government wanted to know exactly what these weapons would do on American soil. They needed controlled environments to test not only the bombs themselves, but also their effects on civilian infrastructure and human survival. In 1951, the United States established the Nevada test site, a massive stretch of desert about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. Over the next decade, this remote location would become the epicenter of nuclear weapons testing in America, hosting more than 100 atmospheric nuclear detonations. To study the real-world consequences of a nuclear strike, the government decided to build mock communities right in the blast zone. These were called survival towns, and they were designed to look like typical American neighborhoods of the time. The idea was to see how homes, cars, and household goods would hold up under the unimaginable heat and force of an atomic explosion. Construction began on rows of single-family houses, complete with kitchens, living rooms, and bedrooms. They were filled with furniture, curtains, dishes, and appliances. Everything you'd expect to find in an ordinary suburban home. Outside, cars were parked in driveways. Some homes were built with different materials and techniques, so scientists could compare which construction methods offered the best protection against a nuclear blast. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was the addition of mannequins. These life-size dummies were placed inside the homes, seated at dinner tables, lounging in living rooms, or tucked into beds. They were dressed in typical 1950s clothing, posed to mimic everyday life. Some mannequins even had wigs and accessories, and entire mannequin families were arranged as if frozen in time. Husbands reading newspapers, wives in aprons, children playing with toys. These eerie scenes were meant to represent ordinary Americans, standing in for real human lives that would have been at risk in an actual nuclear attack. When the bombs went off, high-speed cameras captured every detail. The tests were designed to answer urgent questions. How far from ground zero would a house be obliterated? Would basements offer any protection? Could civil defense measures like duck and cover drills actually save lives? To find out, scientists and military personnel detonated nuclear devices of varying sizes and monitored the destruction. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. In an instant, houses closest to the blast were vaporized, reduced to splinters and ash by the heat and shockwave. Structures farther away were torn apart, their walls collapsing, roofs ripped off like paper. Cars were flipped, scorched, and mangled beyond recognition. And the mannequins, those seated near windows, were shredded by the flying glass. Those in collapsing rooms were crushed under debris. The mannequins in basements fared better, but many were still battered and burned. It was a grim reminder of what these weapons could do to real human bodies. These survival towns weren't just scientific experiments. They were also public relation tools. The government filmed the explosions and released footage to the public as part of civil defense campaigns. The goal was to educate Americans on how to protect themselves in case of a nuclear attack, even though the truth was clear. Survival near ground zero was almost impossible. The famous duck and cover drills taught in schools were based on the idea that distance and quick action could save lives in an emergency, but the footage from survival towns painted a much darker picture. Still, the government wanted people to believe that preparedness mattered, so the films emphasized which building materials held up best and suggested that basements could offer some protection. For many Americans, these images became iconic symbols of the atomic age. Black and white clips of mannequins being blown to pieces and houses erupting in flames were shown in newsreels and educational films, searing themselves into the collective memory of a generation. In the setting, the Nevada desert, added to the surreal nature of it all. These fake towns stood as eerie outposts of suburban life in an otherwise barren landscape, existing only to be annihilated. The blasts themselves were massive spectacles. Some tests were announced publicly, and people in Las Vegas could actually see the mushroom clouds rising on the horizon. Hotels even advertised atomic bomb parties where guests would sip cocktails and watch the sky light up. It was a bizarre mix of entertainment and existential dread, as the destructive power of these weapons became both a scientific curiosity and a tourist attraction. Over time, the tests grew in scale and ambition. Different survival towns were built with new materials and layouts, and experiments included everything from gas stations to electrical grids. In some cases, scientists even placed animals near Ground Zero, pigs and sheep outfitted in protective gear, to study the effects of radiation on living creatures. These tests provided valuable data, but they also raised ethical questions that linger to this day. What was the cost of this knowledge? Beyond the destruction of property and the unsettling imagery, nuclear testing exposed countless workers and nearby residents to harmful radiation. The fallout from these tests drifted over large areas, contaminating the environment and leading to health problems that would emerge decades later. The legacy of the Nevada test site is a complicated one. On one hand, the data collected from survival towns influenced building codes and civil defense strategies, shaping how the US prepared for nuclear conflict during the Cold War. On the other hand, it left behind a trail of environmental damage and human suffering that cannot be ignored. Today, some of the remnants of these fake towns still exist. The crumbling foundations of houses, rusted cars, and fragments of mannequin bodies can still be found at the Nevada National Security Site, now a restricted area managed by the Department of Energy. Occasionally, guided tours are allowed, giving visitors a glimpse into this haunting chapter of history. Walking among the ruins, it's hard not to feel a chill at the thought of what these towns represent. The intersection of science, fear, and the unimaginable power of human invention. The story of the survival towns is more than just a curious footnote in history. It's a reminder of the lengths nations will go to prepare for war, and the surreal ways in which everyday life can be simulated, studied, and ultimately destroyed in the name of security. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about technology, morality, and the fragility of the world we build around us. In the end, these fake towns were never meant to last. They were built to die, to burn and crumble so that we could learn. And what they taught us was sobering, that the world we know, our homes, our families, our ordinary routines, can vanish in the flash of light and fire. As we look back on this era, with its atomic tests and mannequin families, it feels like a warning from history, frozen in the desert dust. A warning that the weapons we create to protect us can also become the instruments of our destruction, and that the line between safety and annihilation is thinner than we'd like to believe. Like, comment, and subscribe for daily history and culture content.